I'm pretty sure that everybody remembers exactly where you were when you heard what was going on at the time of... I guess the reason we call it October 7th is because we don't really want to associate this event with Simchas Torah. So I walked, my house is across the road from our Chabad house. I walked across the road, and it was like walking into another reality. As I got to shul, this is in the morning for Shachris, the security volunteers who were standing outside the shul said to me, as I got there, they said, you need to understand that we are on high alert. I didn't really take it that seriously. Okay, we're on high alert. You know, sometimes they play these things up. So I said, well, what's the high alert? So he said, the security guy said to me that there's been an attack on an army base in Israel. So I said to him, I'm sure it was an attack on an army base. It was probably like a border post or something like that, because it was such an unthinkable concept. Walked inside the shul and we started davening Shachris. A few days earlier, 2 weeks earlier, on Yom Kippur, throughout the whole Yom Kippur, Kol Nidre, before Yizkor, before Ne'ilah, every time I got up to speak, I shared something about the Yom Kippur War, because it was the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, so I spoke about something. Every single part of Yom Kippur, I spoke about something to do with the Yom Kippur War. And one of the things that I described before Yizkor was the scene, or the multiple scenes in Israel at the time of Yom Kippur in 1973, of people being called out of shul. In the middle of Shachris on Shmini Atzeres morning, one of the members of our shul was called out of shul. And it was surreal. It was this deja vu, in a sense. It was this replaying of the story that I had told everybody on Yom Kippur. And he was called out of shul to be told that his son had just been called up and they were deploying next to Gaza. So it was at that point we started to realize there's a little bit more happening over here. It's not just an attack on some little border post. At that point, another member of the shul who I always used to joke, in the early days of our Chabad house, there was this miracle of the 10th man of the minyan in the early days, because what would happen is we'd be standing with 9 people waiting for a minyan, and there was one of the fellows who'd walk outside. He'd spend 2-3 minutes outside, and then he'd come back in, and miraculously shortly after that a 10th man would appear. So we never got into the details of what telepathy he was using to get people to come. So somebody had a similar telepathic connection to Israel. In the middle of shul, it went outside and came back in and had updated information directly from somebody pretty senior in the military, and we started to get a picture of what was going on and how serious things were. And it was in real time for us, because it's the same time zone as Israel, so it was literally in the same time that things were unfolding, it was unfolding for us. So we were davening at the same time that people in Israel were either davening or being called out of shul. It was quite a surreal experience. And when it came time to sit down to the Kiddush on Shmini Atzeres, by that stage we already had a sense that this was a devastating attack. And we had a sense of the numbers that were coming through at that point, which were not yet accurate numbers. And there was this dark cloud that settled over the whole community. there were a few boys from our community who are in active service. So their parents were worried, where they were. Had they been engaged? Had they been called into service? And while all of this is going on, one of the fathers in our shul walks in, and his son was in one of the bases that were attacked. And as it happens, he, Baruch Hashem, was okay, other than the fact that he had burst eardrums and he had smoke inhalation and he spent a few days in hospital. But most of his unit did not survive. This is a kid of 18 years old who had just literally come out of his initial training. And in the following week had to go to 6 funerals of his friends. So it really hit home. We didn't know, of course, all of those details, but at that point it really hit home that this was real and this was close to home, and it was devastating. It was a devastating experience. I don't have to describe to you because it was devastating for all of us. And there's no question about it that the events as they unfolded on Shmini Atzeres and then going into Simchas Torah, by you it was already on Simchas Torah, really rattled us as a Jewish nation, really shook us very profoundly, shook us to the core of our beings, to the extent that it's probably fair to say that we're still shaken. I think the rest of the world kind of expects that we've gotten over this, and we haven't begun to process what's happened. Every time that we hear about another person who succumbed, or another story of what actually happened, or another soldier who's been wounded or worse, it reopens all of the wounds for us. We're a nation, a global Jewish nation that has been shaken to the core of our beings because we witnessed something that they promised us would never happen. We witnessed something that was supposed to be from the history books. We witnessed something that we were supposed to be safe and protected from. And here it is, in front of our eyes. And then on top of that, to see the incredibly horrible response around the world, I think it's left many of us reeling, like, what is this? My wife's grandmother, Tzelanga Yoren, is a Holocaust survivor. And she is beyond herself. These are people who left from Eastern Europe, settled, made Aliyah in Israel. Her husband, her late husband, who passed away only last year, he fought in the early days of the Haganah. These are people who saw it. They saw the unfolding of global anti-Semitism. They suffered at its hands. They lost their family members. To her, the thought that this is recurring in our world is something that is so profound, she doesn't know how to respond to the information. And neither do we. And if you are, as most of us are, plugged into the media, then it doesn't go away. And when I say the media, I'm not necessarily talking about mass media, because why would you do that? But all the media that we're getting from our friends and the WhatsApp groups and the social media, it's incessant and it's continuous and it doesn't stop. And it's just doom and gloom and hatred and vitriol and tearing down menorahs and graffitiing. I saw on the highway from the airport on the way in, I saw that you, Baruch Hashem, also have graffiti over here. Free who knows what. "70 years before this event, in 1954, on Simchas Torah evening, the Rebbe sat at a Farbrengen in 770, and not far from that Farbrengen, there was another party, and it was not a Simchas Torah party. It was mixed. There were Jewish participants, but it was a mixed event, dancing and doing who knows what, and people were very agitated by the fact that there was this noise and commotion that was coming from this other party that was nearby to 770. And even though it doesn't record in the Sikha what the response of people was. The talk around the story is that there was a level of agitation, and people were quite annoyed by the fact that there was this disturbance going on down half a block away. And the Rebbe addressed this inappropriate celebration that clashed with Simchas Torah. And what the Rebbe said at that particular Farbrengen 70 years ago was well ahead of the time and was an incredible insight into what is happening right now in our world. You know, yesterday I mentioned the fact that one of the icons that represents the current conflict is the tunnels. This network of tunnels. This incredible, I mean, I was in New York just shortly after Simchas Torah, and they had to explain to New York, how do you explain anything to people in New York? You know, you explain it because I don't know how much you know about people in New York, but New York, there's geography is split into two types of geography. There's New York and out of town. So you could live in New Jersey or you could live in Tasmania, you're out of town. So how do you explain to people in New York what this whole network of tunnels is? They said it's bigger than the New York subway system. That blew people's minds. How could there be anything that is larger than the New York subway system? This incredible network of tunnels. How long did it take? How much material did they use? How many truckloads upon truckloads upon truckloads to create this labyrinth under the ground? Big enough to move vehicles, to have munitions factories and military headquarters. We know that back in 2006 when Gilad Shalit was abducted, they went into tunnels. Years of investment below the surface. We have cousins who live in Kibbutz Sa'ad. I once visited them. You know when I visited them? Rabbi Johnson was speaking in the previous shir about the evacuation or the expulsion from Gaza. So I was there just about a year or two before. We spent a Shabbos in Gush Katif. And on the way in, we stopped at Kibbutz Sa'ad, which is across the street. It's across the street from Gaza. And when the attack happened, we were really worried about the relatives in Kibbutz Sa'ad, which miraculously was untouched, because they lock the kibbutz. There were a few different kibbutzim that keep Shabbos. They lock the gate. The terrorists, Yimach Shemam, couldn't get in. But the cousins in Kibbutz Sa'ad tell you that they have heard many times, they've heard noise under the ground. The excavations of these tunnels, they've heard it. This is years in the making. Years of developing a system that nobody sees coming until eventually it erupts onto the surface. Years of creating tunnels, not only in Gaza, but years of creating tunnels throughout the whole of Western society to get inside of the academia of Western society, to get beneath the surface where nobody sees the insidious effects of the brainwashing of young people so that they should have a world view which is contrary to the values of Judaism, the values of decent people. This is a war of tunnels. This is an anti-Semitism of tunnels. This is a war that happens beneath the surface, and by the time they ambush you, you don't realize just how big the problem is. But ze leumas ze asa Elokim. Everything that happens in the world of impurity is only that way because it is a mimicry of what's happening in the world of holiness. Nothing can survive in darkness alone. Nothing can survive in a vacuum. It's got to plug in. It's got to somehow draw energy from something that is healthy and whole and holy. And the only way that you can stand up to what is happening in the world is you have to preempt. You have to preempt in the world of holiness what is about to erupt in the world of impurity. And I believe that the Rebbe preempted the tunnels of darkness that would burrow under the infrastructure of society by building tunnels of holiness that would burrow into the very fabric of the Jewish, and dare I even say, the non-Jewish world. Seeding values and perspective within us in a way that we didn't even realize was happening, so that we'd have the wherewithal to stand up to this new anti-Semitism. Very soon after all of this erupted and Israel started to respond and started to attack Gaza, and you know how it is, everybody becomes an expert. Well, I mean, we're very privileged people. We have so many military experts in our communities. The question is only where the greatest experts are to be found. Is it in the middle of the Torah reading, or is it at the mikveh in the morning, you know? But we have incredible, if anybody from our shuls would be the Rosh Memshalah, this thing would have been solved already 3 days after it happened. So one of the things that all the discussions produced was a sense of a wistfulness, a sense of what we're lacking. Many people, and I'm sure you've heard it, or perhaps you even said it yourself, many people said, if only we had the Rebbe's voice. If only we could know what would the Rebbe want us to do right now. If only the Rebbe would get up and say a sikha, follow these steps, do this thing, this is what the Israeli government should do. We'd have a sense of clarity. We feel so lost. We don't have somebody who can give us the kind of clarity they had in the 6-Day War and in the Yom Kippur War. We don't have that today. And we all felt quite adrift and quite lost. And I'm not sure that was absolutely accurate, to be honest. Let's do a little exercise. Hopefully some people over here were from that period that they can actually weigh in with real statistics. But let's do an exercise, okay? So at the time of the 6-Day War, what was the Rebbe's big campaign, the solution to the threat that hung over Israel at the time? Was the Tefillin campaign, yes? The Tefillin campaign that we have spoken about as Lubavitchers, we have spoken about for decades. We have told people that it was the Rebbe's Tefillin campaign, and that's what won the war, which is true. So here's the question. How big was the campaign? How many people were impacted by the Rebbe's call to put on tefillin in 1967? So unfortunately, we didn't have all the fancy organizations that we have now, GEM to take videos of it, and America's 302 to put out a whole thing about it. We didn't have all of those organizations. So maybe the statistics are a little bit blurred. But let's try to work it out. How many people took the Rebbe's call to the streets at that time in 1967? How many people? What, a few dozen, a few hundred? Shall we be really generous and say there were 1,000 Hasidim who went out onto the streets and put on tefillin with people? Maybe. And where did it happen? Where were these foot soldiers by and large? On the front. Israel mainly. Most of the effort was in Israel. And then probably in New York, London, Toronto, I don't know, the larger Jewish centers at the time. And how many of the religious world spoke out against the Tefillin campaign in 1967? Everybody. And the Rebbe had to defend himself multiple times in public, explaining why. And the Rebbe says clearly in a sikha shortly after the 6-Day War, Shabbos Bereshis, 1967, the Rebbe says, it's not my manner normally to get into these debates, but we have to defend why it is that people should be putting on tefillin with people. Can you imagine? We had to defend to the religious world why Jews should encourage fellow Jews to put on tefillin. Who was the audience listening to the Rebbe's call and clarity at that time? It was a small audience. It was us. And today? Today, people are knocking on the doors of the Rebbe's network all over the world. You know, there's a shliach in St. Lucia, tiny little island, Rabbi Ari Shishler, who put out a message on social media that if somebody commits to put on tefillin, this was a few days after the attack, if somebody commits to put on tefillin, he will arrange to sponsor them a pair of tefillin. How did the story end? 1,400 pairs of tefillin. Who in 1967 was putting on tefillin in St. Lucia? I'm not saying all the people who came for tefillin were from the island, but the fact is the Rebbe created this network that nobody saw developing beneath the surface, this tunnel network of holiness burrowing into the Jewish world so that there would be agents all over the world, that when the time would come to ask for clarity, how are we supposed to respond to what's going on in the world, there would be ready people with ready answers, with ready action to take to respond to what's going on in the Jewish world at a time where we're all tracing, where we're all so shaken we don't know how to respond. There it is. There are tunnel shafts in every single Jewish community, and even places that are not even full communities. Little islands in the middle of nowhere where people go for a vacation here and there. There's a tunnel shaft to get into the depth of what Judaism is all about. But that's not even the real chap of it. Somebody I know was in Yerushalayim for Sukkot, and it's, you know how it is. People go to Israel for Sukkot, you go to Yerushalayim, it's a great experience, and there's a lot going on, and it's an incredible vibe, and there were concerts every evening, and Simchas Beis HaShoeva. I had two of my own daughters who went from New York to spend Sukkot with their sister who lives in Yerushalayim. So they were sending pictures and videos and having the time of their life. And then Shmini Atzeres happened. And suddenly everything came crashing down, and they had this tremendous traumatic experiences. You can imagine in the beginning there were rumors about terrorists in Yerushalayim, so they were too scared to go anywhere. It was really, as you can imagine, very overwhelming. Somebody I know who was in Yerushalayim for Sukkot, it was not in Yerushalayim, sorry, in Israel, not in Yerushalayim, for Sukkot. So the next morning, which for us is still Simchas Torah, but in Israel is now Isru Chag, it's no longer Yontiv, where this particular person was staying, they asked if they could get volunteers to make tzitzis to send to soldiers. And she said to them, "Are you kidding? Which soldiers are looking for tzitzis?" Now, I don't know if you know this, but a lot of the Frum soldiers in active combat remove their tzitzis in active combat. Because it's working in close quarters, they're carrying so much gear, it is so hot, it gets so stuffy that one less thing to wear, they'll get rid of it. And they have halachic reason, they've spoken to whoever they've spoken to, and they don't wear tzitzis when they're in active combat. Who's now volunteering? She said, "You're meshuggah. Who's going to want tzitzis? Where are you sending these tzitzis to?" Well, we all know the story, right? Or maybe you don't know this part of the story. That we in South Africa got a phone call from one of the tzitzis production factories in Israel to ask if we had a factory in South Africa that could produce more tzitzis, because the flight is not so far and the cost would obviously be favorable, to produce more begodim, more of the tzitzis garments, because they ran short. Who would have ever expected Israel to call South Africa for extra pairs of tzitzis? Now, who was running this whole mega tzitzis distribution campaign across the soldiers of Israel? Was it Lubavitchers? Was it Chabadniks? No. Not at all. We can't claim this one, sorry. It wasn't us. And who was giving out pairs of tefillin to soldiers in Israel? Not exclusively us. There's a guy that I follow on social media. He's a Litvish comedian, which may sound like an oxymoron, but he's... And as soon as the war broke out, he started posting to other Jewish comedians, because he's in the industry, challenging them to put on tefillin and take a picture and share on their social media to encourage their followers to put on tefillin. Is he a Lubavitcher? No. Is he doing Miftzah Tefillin better than us? Because the Rebbe successfully tunneled into the psyche of the entire Jewish world, that it's clear to us that while in 1967 people said, "How can you put on tefillin with Jews who are not religious or haven't washed their hands in the morning, or maybe are looking at people who are dressed inappropriately," those Jews now think, there's a war in Israel, you've got to put on tefillin with as many people as you possibly can. Tunneled right into the core of the Jewish people. So we have this collective awareness that this is what we're supposed to do. In South Africa, we have a very large school system called the King David school system in Johannesburg, which is a very large Jewish school system, but not a religious school system. In the week following Shmini Atzeres, the kids in the school who officially have prayers every single morning, and very often what prayers means is that you go to shul, you put on your tefillin, and you spend the whole time seeing who could whip the person next to them with the tefillin straps the hardest. And you're not required to put on tefillin, so a lot of the boys don't put on tefillin. They just go and they sit through the prayers and they don't participate. But in that week, the kids, not the teachers, the kids set up a table during recess to put on tefillin with their fellow students, because it was obvious to them that if Israel is in crisis, we need to be putting on tefillin. At the same time that there is a new anti-Semitism in the world, there's a new Judaism, not new, but a new experience of Judaism that is emerging, a Judaism that we haven't seen before. A Judaism that doesn't fit into the classical classifications of who's religious and who's not religious and who does this and who doesn't do that. It's a whole different experience of Judaism. One of the most moving messages that I saw, which was a few days after the original attack, was from a fellow I'd never heard of him before, and I suppose in Israel he's a well-known entity. His name is Omer Barak. Did you see this? Did you see his post? Omer Barak writes the following, and I could check the date, but it was within the week straight after the October 7th attack. Omer Barak writes, Asiti cheshbon nefesh. I did soul searching, he writes. I did soul searching. And I realized, he says, that I grew up my whole life thinking of myself as Ish Ha'olam, a man of the world. I am, he writes, an author, a journalist, and a screenwriter for TV. But I never identified as Jewish. He says, I was born Jewish, and that's where it ended. I grew up in a family, he says, that despised Yahadut, that despised Judaism. I felt it was completely inconsequential. It didn't even appear in my Te'udat Zehut, in my identity document, did not even say Jewish. He says, but now after the events of the last few days, I've had a realization that this is everything that I am. This is the essence of what I am. Ani Yehudi. He says, so this Friday, I got my children together and we decided we're going to light candles before Shabbos. He says, I didn't know what brocha you're supposed to say over the candles. So I thought the one brocha that I know is Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah. He says, that's what we did. He says, I'm sure God will understand. He says, I don't know if we'll light the candles every single week, but I do know this. Ani Omer Barak, Sofer, Itonai, Yisraeli, Veyehudi. I identify now not only by the things that I do, or by the statehood and citizenship that I have, but by the essence of the fact that I'm Jewish. And I feel that Omer Barak speaks for hundreds of thousands like him across the Jewish world. You've seen, because everybody here has WhatsApp, so you've seen, I'm sure, the dozens and hundreds of different videos and pictures. The picture of the guy with a tattooed arm, did you see that? With a tefillin on his tattooed arm, and the caption says, it's been a while, but I figured this is a good time to start again. The groundswell of people responding with the fact that we have to show we're Jewish. I went to Pigisha, which is a big get-together of university students from around the United States, and there were a few from South America as well. The Shabbos, 2 Shabbos after the Shmini Atzeres, or 7th of October attacks. And in the preparation for this event, I was quite nervous, college campus kids, 21st century, how woke can you go? Who am I going to be dealing with over there? How do people identify? What are their issues going to be? I was really I come from South Africa, we don't know about this whole woke business. They first world problems. When you live in an environment and you don't know if you're going to have water tomorrow, you don't worry about if you're male or female. You just worry about if you're going to have water tomorrow. So I didn't know how I was going to be able to deal with all the issues that were going to come up. Arrived at this Shabbos, there's 1,200 students, and there was only one singular focus on their minds. And that was, Ani Yehudi. I'm Jewish. That's all that counted. They didn't say one word, not a peep about gender identity. Not a peep about issues of equality in Judaism. All the classical things that you would have expected. All they wanted was reassurance of the fact that I'm Jewish and that's okay. That I'm Jewish and I should be proud. Every one of them walking around with a chain with a Magen David or a Chai on it. It was magnificent to see. Benny Friedman got up and sang over there, Nachnu Ma'aminim, B'nai Ma'aminim, and these kids were on fire. You would think that they had never been to a rave in their lives. Because at the same time as there is a new anti-Semitism, it is only because we're at the threshold of a new stage of being Jewish. The anti-Semitism of old was an anti-Semitism that fought against the things Jews do and try to block the things that Jews do. The new anti-Semitism fights against Jews' identity, who Jews are. You're not the true Jews. Your Ashkenazim are not really Jewish. Your DNA is from who knows where. The fact that the Temple Mount is called the Temple Mount because it has the archaeological remains of the temple is a fiction. The attack on the fact that who we are, the essence of our being, is invalid. That we're the oppressors. That we're the new Nazis. It's an attack on the core of our identity, the reason being because just before Mashiach comes, the core of our identity erupts to the surface. The previous Rebbe has a fascinating mimer, discourse, based on the words that say, the prophecy, V'hoya b'yomahu, it will be on that day, Yitoka b'shofar gadol. The great shofar will be blown. Uvo ha'ivdim be'eretz Ashur v'hanidochim be'eretz Mitzrayim, and those Jews who were lost in the lands of Assyria and those who were wandering in the lands of Egypt will all come back v'hishtachvu l'Hashem, and they will bow to Hashem b'Yerushalayim, in the holiest place on earth, the eternal capital of the Jewish people in Yerushalayim. And the Frierdiker Rebbe says, in the 1940s, there's no shofar to speak of. It's not like some person's going to stand on top of the roof of some building in Jerusalem and start blowing a shofar. The shofar is an awakening. It's an awakening as a result of a cataclysmic event. Something will happen that will shake up the Jewish people to such an extent that we'll have no choice but to wake up. We'll have no choice but to respond. No matter where we are, if we're in Mitzrayim, which is the symbol of living in places where it is difficult and painful to live as a Jewish person, or whether we're in Ashur, which comes from the word Osher, a place where life is good, we're in democratic societies, they love us, Judeo-Christian values, everybody has a voice, freedom of practice of religion, freedom of speech. No matter where you live, you're going to come back and recognize we're not citizens of any of those civilizations. We're Jewish. We belong to Yerushalayim. He says that's what's going to happen just before Mashiach comes. The Frierdiker Rebbe said that, as you may have seen, today's Hayom Yom, in the shadow of the Holocaust. In 1967, the Rebbe shared a mimer of his own based on this verse and based on the previous Rebbe's Maimer. And at the same Farbrengen where the Rebbe said this Maimer, Shabbos Bereshis, 1967, the Rebbe said something incredibly powerful, a number of things that are incredibly powerful and so relevant. And they take us back to what happened 70 years before the October 7th massacre, where a group of Jews were having a party a few hundred meters away from 770, an inappropriate party that did not belong in a Simchas Torah. And the Rebbe spoke about it that evening at the Simchas Torah Farbrengen. And he said, there's a teaching of the Baal Shem Tov. Now, the way I'm going to share it now is not how the Rebbe said it in the Farbrengen. It's just to illustrate the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov. Have you ever walked over to the fridge and looked inside and then decided there was nothing worth eating? And what happens less than 5 minutes later? We're back. We're back at the fridge. And we look back inside. And you've got to ask yourself, well, what do you think changed in these last 5 minutes? Do you have an AI fridge that has worked out that nothing inside was to your satisfaction, so it repurposed some of the ingredients and created a new dish while you were away? So now, badam, you're going to look inside and then... Or are you the eternal optimist who believes there must be something behind something? Or did you simply lower your standards? The Baal Shem Tov says none of the above. The Baal Shem Tov says in Tehillim 107, the Pasuk tells us, Re'evim gam tzemeim nafshom bohem tis'atov. That when people are hungry or thirsty, their soul is wrapped up inside that hunger and that thirst. The soul is looking for something. The human brain doesn't know how to interpret what it's looking for, so it translates the yearning of the soul into the urge to eat when we're not hungry. That's why we're opening the fridge, because if we were hungry, we would find food inside. But we're not, we're peckish. We just need a snack. We're trying to fill a void inside of ourselves, like the void in the field that we learned about yesterday. We're trying to fill a void inside of ourselves, and we think that the chocolate's going to do it.
That's in the pantry.
I know. There's a running joke. I have a Tanya Shir in Johannesburg, and there's a running joke in that Tanya Shir that I clearly have an obsession with chocolate because it always comes up as an example for all kinds of things in Hasidus. So there you go. Yeah, it's in the pantry. After the fridge fails, that's where you go next. And so the Baal Shem Tov says that you could have a person who exhibits the signs of hunger, the signs of thirst, because they're misinterpreting the fact that the neshama is saying, I want something meaningful. And it might be lurking inside that food. There might be a spark of holiness in that food that if I use it properly and I turn the nutrition into a way to serve Hashem, I'll unlock that spark of holiness. That's possible. 70 years before the October 7th attack, on the eve of Simchas Torah, the Rebbe says, those people gyrating to music that is not appropriate for a Simchas Torah just down the road are doing so because their neshama feels that it's Simchas Torah, and the neshama knows that today we have to dance, and they just don't know how to interpret it appropriately. So they're manifesting the neshama's wishes in an inappropriate fashion, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the neshama is talking to them in the language of Simchas Torah. And 70 years later, thousands of young Israelis are dancing because their neshama wants to participate in Simchas Torah. Because the Ani Yehudi inside of themselves is trying to talk over the music. And the forces that want to suppress the essence of the Jewish people have no knowledge of the fact that this is when they're going to be inspired to try and attack. And in 1967, the Rebbe says, V'haya bayom ahu yitokah b'shofar gadol. There's going to be this great shofar that is going to shake us to the core of our beings. He says there will be a totally different shofar to the shofar that blew when Hashem gave us the Torah at Sinai. Because there too was a shofar. There was a shofar that got louder and louder. It was a shofar that you could identify. It was a shofar you could hear. It was a shofar that reverberated around the entire environment. Everybody trembled from the sound of that shofar. And the Jewish people responded to the shofar. They were inspired by the shofar. They saw Hashem's miracles. They saw the 10 plagues. They saw the splitting of the sea. They saw the revelation at Sinai. It was so compelling. It was so overwhelming. It was so exciting. It was so attractive that it was natural for them to reply and to be dedicated to that shofar. Because it was so strong. It was so undeniable. And it was not as strong as the shofar before Mashiach. V'hoya bayom ahu yitokah b'shofar gadol. Yitokah is a strange word. It's a reflective verb. Yitokah. The shofar will be blown. It doesn't tell us who's going to blow it. Is Mashiach going to blow the shofar? Is there a dedicated pre-Mashiach shofar blower job? Can we apply for the job? How do you sign up? I don't know. Maybe there's somebody in the community who really blows the shofar well, and they should be signing up for that job. It reminds me a little bit of the story of the guy whose job it was in the little shtetl, that he had to be the sentry to look out when Mashiach's coming. It was his job to blow a shofar and tell everybody Mashiach had come. So one day a tzaddik from a neighboring town comes to the little shtetl and he sees this guy. He's the only person awake in the middle of the night. He says, "What are you doing up in the middle of the night?" He says, "I have an important job." So what's your job? "My job is when Mashiach comes, I have to blow the shofar, wake up the whole town." The tzaddik speaks to him for a few more minutes, realizes he's a really sincere Jew. He's obviously got a very pure neshama. He says, "You know what? Can I offer you a job? I need somebody to be my shamash. And I've interviewed around and I haven't found anybody who's suitable to be my shamash. Maybe you could be the guy. I'll pay you a salary, everything will be great." He says, "Let me think about it, I'll come back to you." Comes back to him the next day, "No, instead of sitting up here in the watchtower every night, you can travel with me and get all the covered and be the shamash of the Rebbe. You coming?" He says, "No, thank you very much, I'm happy." He says, "What do you mean? You don't want to come with me and have the glory of being the Rebbe's right-hand man?" He says, "Rebbe, with all due respect, you're offering me a wonderful position, but the position I've got now, that's guaranteed for life." Who's going to blow the shofar before Mashiach comes? Yitokah, the shofar will blow from some invisible source. Says the Rebbe, it will blow from such a deep place that there is no way to identify it. There's no name for it. There's no classification. There's no definition. You're talking about the very essence. The very essence will erupt before Mashiach comes. The very essence of the Jewish people. Not a shofar of inspiration, but a shofar that blows in spite of all the negative. Because if Hashem had made a miracle on Simchas Torah, and just like this, all of those Hamas terrorists would have disappeared in a puff of smoke, and then we would have all been inspired, that would not be a surprise. It makes sense that when Hashem does something out of this world for us, that we should respond with some level of commitment and dedication.
I'll take it anyway.
Of course we'll take it.
Yeah, I will take it.
But it's not what happened. We're never allowed to speak negatively about something in the future, but we are allowed to be honest about what was in the past. And what was in the past was far from what any of us could ever accept. You would have thought the response would be cynicism, rejection. Where was God? I don't think any of us expected the response that we got. I don't think any of us expected Israeli soldiers who come from the same kind of background as Omer Barak did. Israeli soldiers like the pair we once had at our Pesach Seder, that in their adult life were experiencing the first Pesach in their lives because they had been brought up on a diet that religion is the problem. Nobody would have believed that those people, whether they be civilian or soldier, nobody believed that they'd be the people lining up to put on tefillin and wear their tzitzis. Or that beautiful story of the restaurant in Tel Aviv that had to go kosher because they needed to be able to supply food for people that would be kosher. Or the guy who arrives on a base, you hear the story from the chaplain, the rabbi of the base. The guy arrives on the base, he says, "Rabbi, I'm here to speak to you. I need you to know this is the second time in my life ever that I've spoken to a rabbi." He says, "Really? When was the first time?" He says, 48 hours ago. Because 48 hours ago, he says, I called a rabbi to my house to guide me on how I could prepare food to be kosher so that no soldier that I deliver the food to would say, "I don't know if I could eat this." And you're the second rabbi because I'm delivering the food for you to distribute on the base. We all know dozens of stories that we have encountered firsthand of people whose response to what's going on in Israel has not been "where was God" as much as "what should I be doing to express my Jewish identity." It is unprecedented. It is unparalleled. In 1967, the Rebbe said in that Farbrengen that the response to the Six-Day War was an unprecedented Jewish response of commitment. But the Rebbe also said that there are two prophecies about shofars before Mashiach. The one is a prophecy from Zechariah that says, "V'Hashem Elokim b'shofar yiska," that Hashem will blow a shofar that will cause the whole world to shudder. That, says the Rebbe clearly in that Farbrengen, happened between the First and the Second World Wars. That's when Hashem caused the world to shudder. But the second prophecy of Yeshaya, "V'hoyo b'yomahu yitokah b'shofar gadol," that at that time the great shofar will blow, "Uvohu ha'ovdim," and all the Jews will come back to their roots. That, and these are the words, you can check the Farbrengen, that the Rebbe said, that is a process that began after the Six-Day War. That's also the same sikha where the Rebbe says, all of the Rebbes foresaw what was going to happen in the future and prepared us for what was going to happen in the future. There the Rebbe is talking about an awakening from the Six-Day War and saying it's the beginning of a process. There the Rebbe speaks in the Maimer about the fact that when the Jews responded to the miracles of the Exodus, it was a response to miracles. But when Mashiach comes, it will be a response to their inner self in the absence of miracles. It's the truth of the essence of our identity. It's who we are. It's not the things we do. This is who we are. I don't know how they found me, but a journalist from the JNS sent me a message shortly after this, the attacks. They were writing an article about Jewish awakening around the world. And the journalist asked me, could we call this the Pintel Yid? Could we call this the awakening of the Pintel Yid? And it really got me thinking, because what is the Pintel Yid? What is it? How would you describe it? Do you have a good translation for the Pintel Yid? Anybody got a good translation? I need it for a journalist in the JNS. What's the Pintel Yid? It's the nuclear essence of the Jew. The Pintel Yid is not in case of emergency break glass. The Pintel Yid is not some nice poetic thing that we use when a person feels a little bit inspired. And then that inspiration might wear off. So they could have a Pintel Yid moment and then it passes. The Pintel Yid is the nuclear core of who we are. That's the Pintel Yid. It's a force to be reckoned with. It's something that once it is alive, it changes us fundamentally. Like the Gemara says, Yesh koine oilamoi b'sha'a achas. that a person can acquire their portion in the world to come in a sha'ah, one pivot, one shift. It's a paradigm shift. I am no longer, as so many people around the Jewish world are bewailing, I'm no longer accepted into the great liberal society I thought I was a part of. I'm no longer secure in the knowledge of people who I thought were my friends. I have no option but to realize this is who I am. I am Jewish, not the Jew who now has to recede and hide in the ghetto, but the Jew who stands up and says, in spite of it all, I'm going to wear those tzitzis, or tefillin, or do whichever particular expression of the essence of my being is the yitoka b'shofar gadol v'yishtachvu l'Hashem b'Yerushalayim, the thing that pulls us back from being completely assimilated into whichever level of world out there we were, to come out of our tunnels, to expose who we are at the surface, to show the world that a Jew is a Jew is a Jew. Ani Yehudi. And as we learned yesterday, the Gemara tells us that if the Jewish nation doesn't do tshuva, then Hashem sends somebody like Haman. We do know that at the time of the story of Haman, the greatness of the Jewish people was that it wasn't a one-hit, overnight wonder of being Jewish. It's something they stuck with for a whole year. A year of threat, a year of difficulty, a year of overwhelm. And I'm not saying, God forbid, that we have to wait a year for Mashiach, but it feels like it's been more than a year already. And we are seeing no signs of any decline in that commitment. Yes, we have our fringe Jews who play the role of, like the Pasuk says, that there's always going to be the fringe element to try and undermine us. But on the whole, the Jewish world is a changed reality to what it was on the 6th of October. It's Yitoka b'shofar gadol. It's the awakening of Mashiach. It's the awakening of the Pinteri, the Yechidah shebenefesh, the core of our soul, the essence of who we are. And that's why we should anticipate that there'll be a lot of pushback against the essence of what it is to be Jewish. But like Rashi points out, when the Torah describes the lineage and the children of Yishmael, it describes them as Nesi'im, which translates as princes, and Rashi says also translates as clouds. Storm clouds that gather, threaten, and look so ominous, but disperse with one gust of wind. The wind that we'll generate, please God, with our persistent and consistent commitment, not only to expressing our own Jewish identity, but to encourage every Jew we encounter to express the essence of their Jewish identity. And that should, in Mitzvah Hashem, reveal Mashiach, the essence of the whole of Judaism, the essence of Hashem revealed in our world, and that should happen immediately.